Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted the transformed Father Gascoigne from Bloodborne the Board Game, right after this. Hey everyone, Sam here from the Tabletop Hub, and we're back painting another miniature from CMON's Bloodborne the Board Game. You're only going to need a handful of paints for this, and I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. So if this is the first time you've painted miniatures, don't worry. You won't need advanced level skills in order to get the look that I got. So let's get stuck in. First of all, I primed the miniature in matte black, and then I took Army Painter's leather brown and applied this to the waistcoat that is right in the pit of Father Gascoigne's stomach. It's quite a tricky area to reach, so we're painting this first so that we don't accidentally mess any work we're going to be doing later on. Next, I took Army Painter's Dungeon Grey and applied this to Father Gascoigne's trousers. Now, a few of you have been asking whether I thin my paints, and that oddly shaped thing that you can see just beyond my hand there is my wet palette. This keeps my paints wet and adds a small degree of thinning in my opinion, and I rarely thin my paints further than this as long as my wet palette is nice and hydrated. But regardless of what you've got at home, don't worry if you don't get an even coat on the first try. It's totally fine to go back and add some more thin coats until it's nice and even. The last thing we want is big globs of paint on our miniature. Next, I took Army Painter's Necromancer's Cloak and applied this to Father Gascoigne's coat. Now, I've heard it often said if you want to paint black clothing or a black surface, you shouldn't just paint it matte black. I'm not sure the full reasoning behind this, but it was said by someone who was much wiser than I am, and it's equally something that I found to be true in my own experience, as it's something we're doing right now with this overcoat. Next, I took Army Painter's Ash Grey and applied that to Father Gascoigne's beard and hair, as well as the inside of the overcoat here at the front of the model. I then added Army Painter's Skeleton Bone to all of the arm and face bandages that we see on Father Gascoigne. Now, this was quite a tricky area to paint, and it was quite hard to film, so I didn't. So here's just a quick spin around of where I applied this paint so you can have a look at it. For Father Gascoigne's feet wrappings, I actually applied Army Painter's Dark Stone here as opposed to the Skeleton Bone because of the imagery that I was working off. And then it was on to the skin. And for that I used Citadel's Flayed One Flesh to give that sickly white look that we see in the reference image that I was using when painting this miniature. Now, before we get to the final details and washing stage, I wanted to add some detail to the base. Now, this is totally optional, but I got some of the stone and rubble mixture I've made here at home and added that to the base with some PVA glue. Then I got some of Vallejo's Dark Earth texture paint and applied this to the areas without stones to add a muddied earth look. If you want to pick up, by the way, the stone mixture that I've made, you can actually find it on my web store. There's a link to it down in the video description. Then it was on to the enamel wash stage. Now, if you don't have enamel washes, you can use some Nuln oil. It would equally work. It's just if you've watched more than one painting guide here on my channel recently, you'll know I'm pretty much obsessed with enamel washes. It's a sickness and I refuse to apologize for it, but apply the wash to the entirety of the model, making sure not to have any massive areas where the wash pools or clumps up. If you're using the enamel wash method, you're going to want to then get a brush with some white spirits on it to go over the wash once it's dried and remove any excess and create some nice shadowed gradients. And this was how he looked after all of that. Now, as one final touch, I wanted to see if I could replicate the bloodied staining that we see going on in this concept art. So to do that, I got some of Army Painter's Crusted Sore and added water to it until it was kind of like a milky consistency. Now here's a little clip of the paint on my palette so you can see how it interacted with my brush, so you can kind of use this as a rough guide to match this with what you get at home. There isn't like a ratio of water to paint that I used. I genuinely just kept adding in a little bit more water from my brush until the paint was at a consistency that I felt was ready to be used. Now, we're almost creating a wash with it at this point, but once I had a mixture I was happy with, I gently touched the brush to some cloth to take off any excess water and then brushed it onto the model. Primarily the hands, the arm wrappings and the face wrappings. And once the water dried, it left a very faint red tint, which I thought looked really great. It's a final little detail that I think goes a long way to adding some character and added detail to this miniature. And that's it. That was how I painted Father Gascoigne from CMON's Bloodborne the Board Game. If you found this tutorial helpful and would like to see my future painting guides, hit the subscribe button below. Alternatively, on the end screen, you're going to see a link to a playlist where you can see the rest of the Bloodborne board game painting guides that I've put together. But until next time, have a great week, and I'll speak to you all soon.